So as many of you know, I was supposed to be joined in this session by our friend Steve Bannon, who last week became the latest political prisoner of Merrick Garland's Committee for Public Safety. No doubt the media thinks this is a potential gotcha sidebar to NatCon 4, but as usual, their narrative is not only wrong, it's corrupt. Let's be very clear about who the people are snickering and high-fiving about persecuting Steve Bannon. They're the same politicians, donors, and journalists who celebrate the serial sexual predator, Bill Clinton. They say nothing about Senator Bob Menendez, federally indicted for being bribed by a foreign nation while still voting on legislation in the US Senate. They protected Jeffrey Epstein and continue to protect his child-abusing Democrat clients. And they cheerlead the illegally open borders now facilitating the trafficking of children, fentanyl, and violent criminals into our country. That's who put Steve Bannon in jail last week for the crime of refusing to cooperate with their 3-year insurrection against the Constitution and the rule of law. And to be very clear, Merrick Garland, like Steve Bannon, ignored a congressional subpoena by claiming executive privilege. And like Steve Bannon, Merrick Garland was also held in contempt of Congress for this act. Yet only one of them is in jail right now, joining Peter Navarro, the former White House trade advisor, for the same crime. If you're Merrick Garland and you ignore a subpoena, you walk free. But if you're anyone else, straight to jail. This is just another reminder that no matter how fed up you are of what the left is doing to this country today, you are not fed up enough. But yet, look around, because the mood of this conference is not anger, but of excitement, because we know this is the first conservative conference in memory where we can look around at our country and the world and say, we're winning. As we get, yes, that deserves some applause, right? So as we gather today for the 4th Conference on National Conservatism, we do so with the wind at our backs. The left is in a global panic, and the corporatist right is utterly irrelevant. National conservatism today is the undisputed majority political coalition and persuasion, not simply in the Republican Party and in America, but across the West. We are not part of the conservative movement. We are the conservative movement. And yet, national conservatives must express this fact not as a boast, but as a responsibility. The country we love, the country we would lead, is in grave danger. Helping America through this moment will be the greatest challenge any political coalition has faced since the Civil War. But we're up for this challenge for the same reason we're national conservatives in the first place. We see the fight we're in for what it is. Our movement is America's slow-kindled corrective to the Washington Republican establishment's willful neglect. We are America's answer to the hollow men who betrayed our workers into corporate exploitation, our taxpayers into unsustainable debt, our sons and brothers into unwinnable wars, and our citizens into unconstitutional servitude. We are and must be conservatives of action. And this is what sets national conservatism apart. We don't live in a fantasy world of what ought to be. We live and will fight to fix in the wreckage of what is. National conservatism is not an ideology or a faction. It's a perspective. It's the realization that the trajectory and stakes of our national politics have fundamentally changed. Even labels like extremism, fanaticism, and weaponized government fail to capture what the elite left has become. They literally convicted their chief political rival of felonies without proving he ever committed a crime. They literally helped a genocidal enemy regime cover up its creation of a global pandemic. They literally conspire to kidnap struggling mentally ill children whose parents refuse to mutilate them. And almost every corporation, university, government agency, newsroom, and Democrat politician and staffer in this country agrees with them. Ladies and gentlemen, there are no more Rubicons to cross. There are no more norms to uphold. America is fighting for its life, and America's elites are on the other side. It's been a long time coming, this realization, but for anyone paying attention, it has been coming. I'm a millennial. In my adult life, I have lived through the elite lies that led us into the Iraq War, the boondoggle that was Afghanistan, the financial collapse, the failure of Obamacare, mass warrantless surveillance by the government and corporations, the China shock, which hollowed out middle America, the opioid epidemic, COVID and its paranoia and cover-up, Hillary Clinton's Russia hoax, the Black Lives Matter riots, and the neo-racist DEI regime. But the real scandal is not that we've endured this generational orgy of corruption, dishonesty, and betrayal. The real scandal is that the elites responsible for all of the above were protected, promoted, enriched, and even celebrated for it. And even today, establishment Washington is led by people who think that's okay because they participated in the system, or got rich off it, or live in fear of being cut off from it. For decades, as elite institutions were captured and corrupted, Republican elites husbanded their influence, hoarded their privilege, and reserved their ire for us. Whenever any conservatives tried to stop or defund the left's march through the institutions, we were smeared by our ostensible leaders as far-right, arch-conservatives, isolationists, and even unchristian. We were told to respect norms, play the long game, while our sovereignty, economy, and culture went up in flames. Like the false prophets of Jeremiah's day, those who claimed to lead us healed our wound lightly, preaching peace, peace, when there was no peace. National conservatism is America's answer to a left destroying our country and a right who wouldn't lift a finger to stop it. The bad news is that the Republican establishment is unprepared, ill-equipped, and too weak to face this moment and its perils, let alone to overcome them. Those unwilling to perceive reality cannot be persuaded by argument. They must be replaced now. The good news is that they are being replaced by us. Do not be tempted to talk about a new fusionism or sharing a big tent with corporate congressional yes-men who voted to fund the left's anti-American jihad all these years. Their time has passed. On the other hand, however tempting, national conservatives need not punish old guard Republicans. All we need to do is ignore them. They wet their beds, now they can sleep in it. Our focus must be on the left and the elite institutions they wield like cudgels. For the fight we're engaged in now is not merely existential. It is also zero-sum. Only one side is going to win, and one side is going to lose. National conservatism represents the side that will not, cannot, and must not compromise away or give up on America. So yes, national conservatives will fight, but to win, we must lead. And we must lead as only national conservatives can today, as the true sole majority of the American right. To reunite the conservative movement, we must first understand how we became so divided under the establishment. The fusionist conservative coalition of the 1980s succeeded because it met the needs of its time. The Republicans who inherited Ronald Reagan's coalition tried to freeze its agenda in amber, even as the country and the threats facing her mutated. Today, Reagan's pro-growth economics and strong national defense have descended into mindless military adventurism and misguided economic abstractions that have only accelerated the degradation of our culture, traditions, and sovereignty. A national conservative coalition must reunify the right by reclaiming the real moral and intellectual traditions the fusionist generation actually drew on. And on this point, pearl-clutching pundits and social media trolls are both wrong. National conservatism does not demand a deviation from Reaganism, fusionism, and constitutionalism, but a reconnection with what those movements actually were. Contrary to the neocon op-eds, the Cold War was won by a nationalist conservatism that resisted global communism and also American imperialism and hubris. Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, and Ronald Reagan all pursued strategies and alliances that prevented wars, not ones that constantly drew us into them. Similarly, national conservatives should reclaim Reaganism from libertarian economic revisionism. Like Reagan, national conservatives can distinguish between free trade in theory and free trade in practice. We understand that predatory foreign commerce must be met with economic self-defense used by Reagan himself, import quotas, protection of American industry, and where appropriate, tariffs levied in pursuit of freer and fairer trade. And there's nothing Reaganist about enriching our geopolitical adversaries by giving them free access to our industries, workers, intellectual property, and markets. Nor should national conservatives dismiss the prudent skepticism of libertarians, from Murray Rothbard to Ron Paul, about sovereignty-stealing outfits like the World Trade Organization and treaties rigged for Wall Street against Main Street. Like William F. Buckley, national conservatives can remind the right not to accept corporate tyranny simply because it's perpetrated by the private instead of the public sector. National conservatives should, on principle, hold corporations accountable when they threaten the values that make this country work. When they debank conservative customers, suppress patriotic speech, and monopolize and distort free markets, corporations must pay a swift, severe, and certain price. We must signal to big tech, big pharma, big ag, and big finance that the conservative movement is not their partisan shield. Our principles are not for sale, and national conservatives are shrewd enough not to be bought by some sponsored op-ed or consulting expert, manipulating words like liberty and free markets to cloak what is merely corporatism. This is the kind of vending machine partisanship that the Republican establishment got us into this mess with in the first place. And Congress must finally do its job and get control of the federal and state agencies the left has weaponized against the American people. No constitutional republic can exist with a Department of Homeland Security who believes that being religious is an indication of domestic extremism. With an FBI that shows up at the homes of peaceful pro-life demonstrators with their guns drawn. With a surveillance state that bucks any check on its own power. These institutions must be drastically reformed or dismantled and rebuilt, not as part of some committee white paper or press conference. And this has to happen next year. Finally, we need a political coalition that has the courage to understand where we are and what is required to battle this country back to a constitutional order. The elite left has no shame or fidelity to their oaths of office. They're not inspired to their better angels because the right sets a better example. We've seen this for decades. They are emboldened by our inaction. They laugh at it. The left isn't going to stop weaponizing institutions against us until they have a taste of their own medicine. until they truly believe the right will use the left's own precedents against them. As during the Cold War, no one wants to live under mutually assured destruction, but as long as amoral adversaries embrace lying, treachery, and terror as legitimate partisan tactics, it sure beats unilateral assured destruction. No one is happy that American politics has become so totalizing. But that's what happens when you stand up to totalitarians. Appeals to the Constitution and the founders and disagreeing without being disagreeable will not move the Alvin Braggs and Fonnie Willises and Jack Smiths of the world. National conservatives are and must be constitutionalists. But for the Constitution to matter again, ever, at all, the right must be prepared to fight on the left's absolute terms. Like it or not, ready or not, they're coming for our rights, our freedoms, and for crying out loud, even our kids. To them, the establishment right has always said, let's make a deal. But to them, national conservatives must say, as the Greeks did, Molan labe, or as the Texans say, come and take it. Let the establishment talk of the high road, because we will take the high ground. We can unite and lead the conservative movement. We can unite and lead the nation. And we can win this fight. Conservative principles are not meek and deferential. That was just our failed former leaders. Our ideas are battle-tested over centuries and forged in the fights that came before us, against authoritarianism, against communism, against tyrants great and petty. They have triumphed over atheism, relativism, nihilism, and fascism. Our values were made for this moment, and they cannot be compromised. The stakes are just too high. The fight we're in is to preserve our whole way of life as heirs to the Western tradition. And we will win, because unlike the left, we know who we are, that we are made in the image of God, that men are men, that women are women, that each precious human person is unrepeatable and unmatched in dignity and worth from conception to natural death. We define our common identity not by our creed or our tribe or our race or our pronouns, but by our country, by the sovereign land in which we have built the freest nation the world has ever seen. America was built by Americans, not simply by ideas, and it can only be saved by Americans too. The left understands this, and they are working right now to make us into a different country. It is a perilous time for the values and the country we hold dear. But champions of the good, the beautiful, and the true do not change with the times. We change the times. We may not have chosen this moment, but as the late Father Richard John Newhouse wrote, we are called to serve faithfully not in the moment of our choosing, but of our testing. The political coalition necessary to save this country is forming now, today, with all of us. With the courage of our convictions, the love of our country, and the faith in our living God, let's get to work. Thank you.